Hey everybody, welcome back. We're doing the Ruby on Rails, and now we're going to do views. Controllers was last. So the view is really the simplest part of the MVC structure. At the basic level, it's just a bunch of HTML boilerplate into which you insert your variables you've received from your controller and which you will be sent to your browser. It's your actual web page. It will often have some snippets of code designed to properly present the variables it has received. For instance, a loop that will display each one of your posts on your blog. Views are often called view templates. Views live in the directory app views controller's name. Cool. And so to check this out, we're going to open up the terminal. I'm going to change directories into my desktop. It's useful programmer, Odin project. Oh no, Odin project directory, and then we have my first Rails app. So in here, I can open this with code, period. Cool, and we get it here. I still had it open. I just wanted to go through this because muscle memory is useful at what I perceive as this stage of your programming life. So I'm going to close out the terminal. I don't need that anymore. And if we open up the terminal list, we can see that this is all the file structure of a Rails app. And then within apps, we've got controllers, and then we have views. And so views live in the directory app views controller name. So controller name for our example was cars, and then there's the action for different ones. So you've got your view, index, edit, whatever. Well, controller name, yeah. So the posts controller running the index action will implicitly render the app views in posts index, right? So if we were to say the cars controller implicitly runs the index. So if you were to go to index here, it gets all your cars and then it shows it to you. And so we've set it up so that if we were to go to localhost cars, and then that's the index for cars, it gives us all these different cars that we have created. Cool. So, and just for hoot, I want to put an HR link here so that it shows that we've got multiple different cars. I see this is the first one, this is the second one, this is the third one, this is the fourth, fifth, sixth. So we've created these over the course of the last few posts, or last few curriculum elements. The post controller runs the index action, which implicitly connects to index.html, posts, so views, posts, index, views, posts, index. The controller's here, and then it goes the views, cars, index. So it's just like that. And so that folder structure is important to the way that Rails, it naturally picks up where you're at. You can explicitly tell your controller to render a differently named view by passing it in as a parameter to the render function in your controller. But why? This directory and naming structure helps you and Rails to always know where to find a given view. To use an instance variable from your view, just call it the same way you would in the controller, at user.firstname or at posts and at some other variable. This kind of assumes a lot of knowledge of Rails. But anyways, as always, in this lesson, we'll cover the high-level stuff that you have read, the Rails guide, for a more detailed understanding of how things work. So yeah, the Rails guide is a way to get the more detailed thing. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to do the following. Explain how view templates and layouts are organized in Rails. Apply ERB in your view files. Create and call a partial. Create dynamic anchor tags in your view files. So layouts. The first thing to note is that the named view template we render from the controller is actually not the entire web page. It doesn't contain the head tag or the doc type declaration or some of the other basic structure that's present in all pages, precisely because those things are present in all your pages. The Rails creators were smart enough to turn that code into its own file called layout. Layout file lives in app views layout. Cool. So if we were to go app views layouts, you see here, then we have this is the overall one. Now, so if we were to inspect this right now, we see that the cars index has just nothing but cars with an exclamation point, and it's got this style thing here. But if we were to look in here and at the index, you see we have the cars only starts right here. This is where this code matches this code. But this code, the body and the head, all exist somewhere else, and they exist in the file called layouts. So if we look at the layouts and our application HTML, this is where we get our head and our body. So you see our body has this yield element right here. So that's where it starts here. And so body starts here, and then here we have the head, and you see my first Rails app, which is here, and we could say useful programmer test app. Now if we were to save that and refresh, you'll see that it'll show up here, and it'll show up here. And so all of this CSRF stuff is what renders out as this. So this is all just automatic Rails stuff. And so that's what they mean by that. For a brand new Rails application, the application.html.erb layout is pretty basic. It's got the basic tags you need for in all web pages, HTML and body. So yeah, HTML and body. And a couple snippets of code that load up the JavaScript and the CSS files your web page will need. You'll want to put anything that's needed across all your web pages into the layouts. Usually this is stuff like nav bars and footers and snippets of code for displaying flash messages. So if a layout is basically just a shell around the individual page, how does this page get inserted? That brings us back to the magic of yield method, which you saw when you learned about blocks. The view template at app views posts index.html gets inserted where the yield statement is. Yeah, when you get more advanced, you'll be able to play around a bit with that statement, but for now, it's just that simple. So, what does that mean? In our example here, index, we've set our routes to make this index.html file be part of this one when we hit that specific one. So we'll talk more about that in the future, but that's basically the idea of it. So, cool. Preprocessors. The other thing you've undoubtedly noticed, is the odd HTML code that goes inside bracket percentage equals and percentage close bracket tags. This is embedded Ruby, ERB. It's a special way of executing Ruby code inside your HTML. HTML is static, so you need to dial in some Ruby if you want to do anything dynamic, like looping, if statements, or working with variables. ERB and another similar language you might see called Haml do exactly that. What those tags do is execute whatever you see inside them as if it was normal Ruby. So opening tag Ruby has like a string inside it. It will output an emphasized piece of text like I am emphasized, and user.firstname might output something like Joe. The difference between percentage and percentage equal is that percentage equal version actually displays whatever is returned inside the ERB tag. If you use percentage, it will execute the code, but no matter what happens is returned by that line. It will not actually display anything if your HTML template. This is used for comments. Okay, cool. So let's do a little bit of playing around with that. So if we go back here and we go to the index page and we say something like 1 is equal to 2. Now this should render out to false, right? But if we come out here, it does nothing. Why is that? Well, it doesn't have the equal sign. So if we were to do that, we see false. 1 is equal to 1. It's true. But without this, it doesn't show up at all. But if we were to say if 1 is equal to 1, we can make a print statement that says 1 is equal to 1, and then we could do an end statement. So then, yeah. And now if 1 is equal to 2, then it won't show up, right? That 1 is equal to 1 did not show up. But if we add the equal sign here and we re-render it, well, this is a bad example, I guess. Yeah, the better example would be like, I see what we could do. Instead of doing it, yeah. Okay, so here's the example. Okay, so cars.each, this is giving us all the cars, right? And then we're rendering cars.each do car, and then we render each car, and then we have a link to show this car, and we put the car in there. So this one would go to the BMW 530. And that's not a cool place to have the car, but anyways. and this one goes to the Ben's class. And so if we were to add the equal sign here, you would see that it would show a it should show like all the cars with each one. Anyways, the equal sign basically renders it, and the other one doesn't. Most of your tags will be equals, because you'll find yourself often just outputting important pieces of the instance variable that you received from your controller, like user.firstName. You use the percentage for purely code-related stuff like if statements and each loops, where you don't actually want anything displayed. The stuff you display will occur in the loop. That's weird that that didn't come out. It should have something there. Anyways, am I at the index? Yeah, we are. Okay. Okay, cool. If this is confusing, here's an example. If we say we want to display the first name of all users in our application, but only in the current user is signed in. This might look something like this. If current user signed in, then we make a list, and within that we're going to each list, we're going to list out the first names. And if the current user is not signed in, we just want to write something that says you must be signed in. There's a typo right there I want to address, tell the crew. Yeah, so I'm actually going to use these to make notes for the Odin team. And I'll be making those in the GitHub Issues tab. Remember to close your statement with loops at the end. So yeah, you've got to close your statements. This is an open statement, and then you need to close it with an end. You'll forget a few times. In the code above, if the user is signed in, and it will actually render to the web something like this. So it'll say the unordered list, and then within each of the users, so in this example there's 3 users, it prints out their user first name. If the user isn't signed in, it will be much shorter. It'll just say you're signed in. You must sign in. In the above code, if we had accidentally used the equal sign, it would run the code fine, but because each returns the original collection, we will see a dump of users variable on our page, which is not very professional. It'll happen to you several times, and you'll learn quick. Okay, cool. So let's take this example and put it into ours and see if we can get it to work. So we don't have, okay, so if, let's just say for this one, if true, no, if 1 is equal to 1, just to make it so it goes. And then we want to say cars.each and do car, and then the car.make, right? Because that should be working. Now, so if we refresh this, it's just going to print out a list of those. But if we come over here and we say if 1 equals equal to 1, no. Let's say if we come over here and say if cars is equal to each, and we refresh, it's going to show each little bit of the cars. It's going to show each car, and it's got all this information, so you don't want that. That's what this is trying to avoid. The each element. Right there, it's gone. And then if we put the equal sign, and this is just something that will make a mistake, and I did that before, and I had to talk to somebody. I was like, why is it printing this out? I don't understand. And someone was like, oh, you've just got to take this equal sign out, and then you can have it like that. So yeah, we'll get rid of this for now. And that's what I think they were trying to show in that last tutorial. Okay, how do preprocessors work? The important thing to note about the above code execution is that it is all done on the server before the final HTML file is shipped over the browser, part of the asset pipeline covered in the next lesson. That's because when you render your templates in Rails, it first runs preprocessors like ERB. It knows you want to preprocess the file because it has an extension of .html.erb. Rails starts from the outside with extra extensions. So it first processes the file using ERB, then treats it as regular HTML. That's fine because ERB by definition outputs good clean HTML like we saw above. There are other preprocessors you'll run into as well. .css, .scss files use Sass processor and become regular CSS files. .js, .coffee files, which use the CoffeeScript preprocessor, become regular JavaScript after being run. It In both cases, the preprocessor's language makes your life easier by giving you some additional tools that you can use, like having loops and working with variables, and compiles back down into plain vanilla CSS or JavaScript or HTML. The point is, there are many different preprocessors. They are usually gems that either already come with Rails or can be easily attached to it. Rails then runs them automatically, so all you have to worry about is whether your files have the right extensions to tell the preprocessor to run. Okay, now we have view partials. Another nice thing you can do in Rails is break apart your views into partials. This helps you on several levels. It makes your code more concise and easy to read, and also lets you reuse certain common patterns. One example is the form for creating or editing users. Both new and edit actions need to render some sort of form for their users, and usually that form is almost exactly the same. So often people will turn that form into a new file called something like _users.form. And if you see over here, you can see that the form has been rendered out. The underscore for initially is what tells you that it's a partial. And so this form is used on both the edit and the new page. Pulling back a bit, partials are just HTML files that aren't meant to be complete, but can be shared by other files. You would call a partial by writing something like this. And so, yeah, render user form. And so if we were to go to the new, we would say render form car. Render user form. There are a couple of syntax oddities that you may pay attention to. The view partial is named with an underscore. Yep, so this is the underscore. Here we've got another underscore. But gets called using just the core portion of the name, user form, for example above. User form. Render user underscore form. And it looks like when you're in the folder, you can actually shorten that up to just render form. If there is no directory specified in a partial's name, Rails will only look for the same folder at which it is called. So that's why you can do form here. I think if you were to go car form, that would also work here. So if we were to go to /new, maybe you can't put it here like that. Car form. Render user form. Car form. Interesting. It's not even letting us do that. I see what they're saying. Oh, so they're making it user form. But if you do the scaffolding, they just makes a form for the natural one. And if we had other elements rather than just car, they're like users and things, we can still write render form because it will default to the directory in which it's in. If it's no directory, it'll default there. So you can just say rendered shared partial. And so the more specific you get, you can bring it in from different folders. So passing local variables to partials, there's a lot you can do with partials, and we won't dive into it all here, but one thing that you might find yourself doing a lot is passing variables to partials. A partial has access to all the variables that the calling view template does, but do not rely on them. What if your partial is used by a different controller that uses a different structure for its instance variables? It's bad code to expect an instance variable like @user to be there with a partial all the time. That means you've got to explicitly pass the partial whichever variable you want to have access to. In the example above, so this is, I totally understand this, but this is probably really difficult for somebody brand new to understand. In the example above, you most likely want to pass the @user variable to the partial so your code can render the right kind of form. So as you can see here, the instance variable is not being used within the form. If you look at the form, we're using what is set to it. And we're not saying @car, we're saying car. And that's just because the form is being passed a variable here. So we set car is equal to the instance variable. And so this is good practice because then you can use this form differently in different contexts. And so here they're doing that. They're just kind of showing you that. In the example above, you most likely want to pass @user variable to the partial so your code can render that kind of form. Render is just a regular method, and it lets you pass in an options hash. One of those options is the locals key, which will contain variables you want to pass your code, and it might look something like this. And what are the options hashes? It looks like there's a lot of information here. Yeah, options hashes are super useful, but it might be out of the scope for this. To use the variable in your partial file, you drop the @ symbol and call it like it is. So yeah, here they're just changing user to here. And this syntax is just this syntax in, I think this is probably older Ruby. I'm not sure. Somebody who's an expert might be able to tell me that. But this is just the same as that. There is a render shortcut that allows you to simply pass the variables without the need for that. So here we've got our render shortcut. We're using that in the scaffolding. Implicit partials. As usually, there are some things you would end up doing so many times that Rails has given you a shortcut. One of these is the act of rendering a model object like user or a post. If you want a list of all your users, you could write out HTML and ERB code for displaying a single user first name, last name, email. Many times directly in your app views users index file, or you could keep that code in some sort of each loop. But it's usually best to make the user into its own partial called _user. So you can reuse it in other cases as well. The basic way of calling this might be something like we saw above, which looks like users.each, render users, if the user as user. And then the partial would come out like this, first name, last name, and that. So yeah, I mean, we could do that here. We could go to index, cars. Well, we're already doing that, render car. And then, so yeah, what they're going to say next is that it may seem strange. I'll describe this in a little bit. It may seem strange to have one line in a partial, but trust me that it usually doesn't stay that way for long. It's worth getting the hang of. Once you get more into like once you format all this stuff and add CSS and IDs and classes to it, this becomes super useful because you can use the same like user list all over the place. You can use it in their profile. You can use it at the top of like their whatever feed or whatever. And that way, when you make really incremental, cool benefits or to that single little component, then it works everywhere else as well. So it's that basic way, that the magical Rails way. Just tell it to render the user object directly. And so yeah, here they're just doing render user, just like we are here in our example. Rails then looks for the _user file in the directory and passes the user variable automatically. What if you want to render a whole bunch of users like we just did? Rails also does that for you the same way, saving the trouble by writing your own each loop we did above. Users render @ users. Oh, wow. So could we do, okay, so here right now we're at the index for cars. Go to the cars index, and then instead of doing cars.each, could we go render cars? Wow, that works too. And then if we wanted to add a link to the cars, we go to the car HTML, DOM ID car. We could say link to the car, and then I think you go edit. We could just say edit and then say edit car path, and then pass car. Link to edit. Cool, that's the car path. Cool, and then this will just give us an edit to each one. You see how it's 1, that one's 2, that one's 3, and you see that down here at the bottom. So yeah, cool. There's another way that we just refactored that, and so that's a cool little thing about Rails. You can just do that. Rails only finds the user HTML. Wow, this is just something I learned. That's cool. File and passes it to the correct user variable to use. It also loops over all the users in your user collection for you. Pretty handy. Helper methods. Okay, Helper methods. Rendering partials isn't the only method you can call from within a view. Rails has a bunch of really handy helper methods that are available for you to use in the view. A few of the most common are linked to. Aha! We just did that one with our with this guy. And so that adds, instead of doing the href and then adding the path in as a string, you can just use a helper method. It's the Rails way, and recall that user's path generates a relative URL like users, whereas user's URL generates a full URL. Cool. Let's check that out. So this one says edit car path. And so if I hover over here, it just goes cars1 edit. And then if I go edit car URL and refresh the page, has the same thing. So I don't really see the difference there in that context. It's the Rails way, and recall that user's path generates a relative URL, whereas user's URL generates a full URL. I get that. In most cases, it isn't an important distinction because your browser can handle both, but make sure you understand the difference. And we remember the relative versus what is there? Generates a full URL. A relative versus a full URL is it just shows the end of it, but everything defaults to that. That's from the foundation stuff. Asset tags. As you may have seen in the application layout file we talked about above, Rails gives you helper methods that output HTML tags to grab CSS or JavaScript files. You can also grab images. These are called asset tags. We'll get into the asset pipeline a bit later, but because these tags locate those files for you based on their prior name and render them properly HTML tags. So you can have your style sheet, JavaScript include tag, and image tag. I think if we go back to the layouts and then the application, you can see those coming here, style sheet tag. And so that's bringing in all the application style sheets, and that's from some TurboTrack stuff. That's in the future. And you can do that with image tags. So this will render something like this. But they usually, it's much more complex than this actually, because they add timestamps into for security. In production, your style sheet and JavaScript will all get mashed into one strangely named file. Yeah, like this. Yeah. So you don't be alarmed if it's named something like application-random collection of numbers and digits. Okay. And forms. Rails offers several different helpers that help you create forms, and we'll go over those in depth in upcoming lessons. So here's our assignment. Now that you've got a taste for a high-level stuff, read through the Rails guides for a more detailed look at things. The chapter below will actually start in the controller, where you need to let it know which view file you want to render. The second half of the chapter gets more into the view side of things. So read Rails guide to Rails guide on layouts and rendering, section 1 through 3.4. You can certainly skim when they start going over all the different options you can pass to a given function. It's good to know that they are what they are and where they can find them, but you don't need to memorize all this. Usually you'll have something that you want to do. Google it and find a Stack Overflow post that shows you the options you can use. Okay, so it's saying 1 through 3.4. Creating responses. Okay, cool. So a lot of this is going to be very useful, but at its core, it is stuff that I'm experienced with. So I would definitely recommend reading through this, but for the context of this video, I don't think that it makes sense for me to go through this stuff. It is stuff that we've seen before. So yeah, Odin Project's great. It does this thing where it kind of describes you all this stuff, and then it tells you to go read the documentation behind it. So I really recommend reading through this documentation, but a lot of this stuff I'm really familiar with, so I'm not going to spend the time of going through it right now. But I do recommend that this is something that you take the time to actually go through. This yield stuff is really important, and so we'll skip that for now. But I recommend everybody else does that. So conclusion, view in general make up the user-facing side of your app. It can be a bit tricky at first to imagine how you choose which view to render, what to include in the view, and how to use partials. But a few iterations of working with Rails will show you the conventions pretty quickly. Views will become second nature to you. So there's some more additional resources. Again, I recommend going through each of these, and I'll do that offline. And so now we're just going to do the knowledge check. So how do you make sure a preprocessor runs on your view file? I'm not sure. It just always happens. Important to know that html.erb. I mean, you can check by going to the thing. If the preprocessor doesn't run, then it's going to either show an error or it's going to not render the correct thing. So what's the difference between the bracket percentage sign is equal, and bracket percentage sign hash? Bracket percentage sign is just for logic, and it won't print out on the screen. It won't actually display in the processed HTML. With the equal sign on it, it will actually display the result of the Boolean or whatever the thing is within the inside. And then the bracket with a comment, with a pound key at the end, is going to render out a comment in the HTML. So what does including yield in the layout do? It basically takes it to a hierarchical level where you're passing that data within another view file. Why do we use partials? We use partials so that we can write code once and have it appear exactly the same way in many different parts of the application. It's part of being dry. Don't repeat yourself. What is the shortcut for rendering a collection of a series of partials? You can just say render and then just hand in the partial name. That should, if everything's lined up correctly on the controller view setup, then you're going to be able to do a lot of stuff with very little code. How do you dynamically link to another page of your Rails app? You can link to, and then whatever that thing is, _ path, and then the ID for that specific one. Okay, cool. We'll mark this one as complete, and we'll move on to the next lesson. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you then.